So my name is Claudia Chwalisz. I'm working at the OECD, which is an international organization made up of 37 member countries who have decided to come together to share their data and good practices in an effort to improve policies for better lives. And within the OECD, I work in the Public Governance Directorate, focusing specifically on trying to better understand the new forms of collaborative, deliberative, and participatory decision-making that are happening today. Analysing what works well and what doesn't, and ultimately trying to figure out how the architecture of our democratic institutions might change in the longer term as a result, incorporating some of these new forms of citizen engagement as a new normal way of doing things. So in my short 15 minutes today, I'll focus on three things. First, very briefly, the context of our current political situation. Secondly, the need to redesign our democratic institutions with a couple of examples where this is already happening today. And I'll end with the need to not only consider our institutions, but also to think about the democratic norms and values that underpin them. And I'll call this democratic fitness. So first, if I get this to work, yes. So how did we get to a point where our politics can be characterized by these three words of polarization, populism, and pessimism? Our politics is increasingly being defined by opposition to the status quo, to the establishment, to our partisan rivals. And while this has always been the case, obviously, to some extent, today it really is at a new extreme. Driven by social change, economic upheaval, technological change as well, I think it's exacerbating some of the worst problems of democracy today. It's feeding partisanship, it's deepening instability, with elections that fracture in parties with no clear majority in sight, and it's driving populist revolts. And when it comes to the, well, I don't know, maybe I just...
some help?
Right. Well, maybe I just keep it like this for now. So when it comes to the drivers of this trend, there tend to be three explanations to this: economic, cultural, and political. So first, the economic. There's an argument that it's the left behind revolting against inequality and globalization. Others argue that it's due to identity and cultural anxieties, which are being aggravated by immigration. And there's definitely truth in both of these theories. But there's a third part of the puzzle which can't be solved just by better policies alone. And that's the trust upon which liberal societies rely upon to function, which has been damaged. And there was never some sort of golden age where everybody loved politicians, but public disenchantment and distrust have reached historic highs when you look into the comparative data of polling records that have been taken from the 1950s onwards. Oh, well, I don't know what's going on with this thing. Maybe we just keep it like this, and
that's a good idea.
So technology is not on my side today. But this trend coincides with ever greater numbers of people feeling that their voice doesn't count. So recent elections and protests around the world highlight that the most economically disempowered don't just feel disillusioned, but completely forgotten by the democratic system. They're distant from any meaningful expression of agency to be able to shape the decisions that are affecting their lives. And in a society where relationships are more horizontal, where news and information is literally at our fingertips, where people feel more interconnected than ever before, is it any wonder that our democratic institutions, which were designed in the late 18th century, feel like they're out of date and that this infrastructure is no longer fit for use? If we were to redesign our democratic institutions today from scratch, knowing how society functions, how collective problem solving works, I doubt we would come up with electoral democracy in its current form as the solution. Now, I'm not suggesting that we scrap this, so don't quote the OECD as saying get rid of electoral democracy. I might get fired if you do that. But I think we can think about redesigning the architecture of our democratic institutions in a way that gives citizens a more meaningful say in shaping those public decisions that affect their lives. So let me briefly take you to two places around the world where democracy is evolving in this way. First, Toronto, where I'm from, but that's not why I chose this example. So this is an image of the first Toronto Planning Review Panel, which met from 2015 to 2017. It's a group of 28 randomly selected citizens, not citizens, actually residents. They don't have to be Canadian citizens to be part of the panel. So from all parts of the Greater Toronto Area. After 4 full days of learning and training sessions, they met every 2 months for 2 years to deliberate on planning issues and give informed recommendations to the planning division on major planning initiatives that were underway. They were selected through a randomized process called a civic lottery. What this means is that 10,000 randomly selected Toronto households received an invitation in the post from the Toronto Planning Division, inviting them to volunteer to become a member of this panel. Amongst the people who applied, the 28 were randomly selected, controlling for the group to be representative of the wider population of Toronto. And as Jennifer Keesmaat, who was Toronto Chief's planner at the time, said, in order to create a culture of meaningful civic engagement, it's really important to provide a window into the planning process. We don't want just random, uninformed opinions. We need people at the table who are thinking deeply about the complexity of the city and of the complexity of the issues that we face. The second planning review panel, with 32 members this time, is now in place. And there's now also a permanent body like this in Toronto, which is devoted to transport issues. Next, on the point of redesigning democratic institutions, the most exciting example is from the German-speaking community of Belgium. At the end of February, the parliament in this region voted unanimously to put in place a new citizens' council of 24 randomly selected citizens. And this citizens' council has an agenda-setting power. They get to decide what are the 1, 2, 3 issues every single year which should be put to citizens' assemblies. And each of these citizens' assemblies is also a deliberative process which is made up of 25 to 50 randomly selected people who meet for a minimum of 3 times over 3 months. It could be longer depending on the issue. And their remit is to give recommendations to the parliament. And it's in the legislation now that the parliament is required to debate those recommendations at least 2 times. And there's an onus on the government to respond to them. And the first Citizens' Council meeting took place a few weeks ago on the 16th of September. Now, I think this is exciting because this design change in the democratic architecture has an impact on the relationship between citizens and government. Not in a way that destroys the system, but in a way that enhances representative democracy by extending the privilege of representation. It is also creating a space where long-term issues can be deliberated without the short-term incentives of elections. Thus far, deliberative processes such as these have been mostly used for those difficult problems that politicians didn't want to take action on for fear of electoral consequences. And these processes and now institutions are creating the spaces to do so. In their modern incarnation, they have a common practice they've been a common practice in many countries around the world since around the 1970s. In the OECD study of deliberative processes for public decision making that I'm leading right now, we have almost 600 examples of them. And these deliberative processes are one way of helping to re-establish trust, not just trust by citizens in government, but also trust by government in citizens and in citizens between themselves. There's a lot of research which shows that trust can only be rebuilt or built in person and over time. Of course, it doesn't happen overnight with just one deliberative process like this in place, which is why there's a need to institutionalize these new ways of involving citizens in public decision making, so that it's not a one-off or an ad hoc process, but that it happens all the time and on many different issues. And that, as we see in East Belgium, it gives citizens opportunities to decide which issues should be up for discussion in the first place. Because we need to remember as well, though, that people don't want to participate all the time. Nor should they. We all have our lives and our families and our jobs and our hobbies, etc. And a functioning democracy shouldn't require everybody to be permanently, constantly, intensely engaged. It needs different levels of participation. And historically, the principles of sortition, the technical word for random selection, and deliberation have gone hand in hand with the often forgotten principle of rotation. You take turns taking on the civic duty. Now, these institutions are only one part of the picture, though. We can't take institutions or checks and balances for granted, which is why I like the notion of democratic fitness, a phrase that I first heard from Peter McLeod of Mass LBP in Canada. It implies that we need citizens who have agency and efficacy, meaning who feel like they have the ability to change things around them, and who have opportunities to flex their civic muscles. Because as the philosopher... I give up on this thing. As the philosopher and reformer John Dewey wrote on democracy from the late 1930s, we shouldn't believe that democratic conditions automatically maintain themselves. For what is actually going on may be the formation of conditions that are hostile to any kind of democratic liberties. Democracy is a habit that needs to be practiced. Its survival depends on a set of habits and dispositions, in other words, a culture to sustain it. For what are constitutions and procedures if you've deformed the ground upon which their proper functioning depends? It's one of the reasons that the work that I'm doing at the OECD around citizen participation is part of a bigger picture, where we're not just focusing on institutions, but also new ways of thinking about public goods, like public services, public spaces, data as a public good, in addition to ways of promoting democratic fitness. How to strengthen people's civic muscles and enable social action. My time is running short, so I won't delve too much into this topic now, but we can pick up on those questions in discussion. I want to leave you with a thought that has resonated with me the past few years. The problem isn't that we ask too much of people, but too little. We all have an innate sense of when our time is being wasted, but when it's for something important, like, for instance, skipping school to act on the urgency of climate change, or devoting 100 hours to develop collectively with fellow citizens proposals for city planning or housing legislation or infrastructure investment, then we see, and there's ample evidence of this from around the world, that people are more than willing to give up their time to be involved. So let's design new democratic institutions that ask more of people in a way that sustains our civic culture and keeps us democratically fit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia, for an inspiring talk, even if we had some technical problems. Has anyone questions? Yes, I see 2 questions. Here we go.
Thanks a lot for your interesting talk.
Would be great if you just could introduce yourself briefly and keep your question.
My name is Elke Fein from the Institute for Integral Studies in Freiburg. We're researching transformative democratic innovations. 2 questions and 1 comment.
Only one question and no comment, please.
Okay. I can be very brief. Question, is there a specific way in which these randomly elected civic councils are facilitated? That was very brief, right?
Good. And the second one?
Thanks. And can you think of, or are there examples of giving more weight to what these councils come up with? You said they are just recommendations to the parliaments, and the parliaments need to debate twice. But are there ideas of giving more weight to that, or practices or experiences?
Great, thank you.
Should I answer those?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So very, very quickly, first on the first question about facilitation, it's really important. There's always an independent organization that is involved to do the moderation and facilitation of the meetings. So there's always experts and stakeholders who have a chance to present. The first stage is always about learning. So people have a chance to get to grips with an issue before being able to deliberate upon it. But it's really important that there are skilled trained moderators whose job is to do nothing but that, who ensure that in small groups nobody dominates. You know, when people are randomly selected, it brings a lot of people who've never gone to a town hall meeting, who've never come to a conference like this, who've never voted. So you don't have the same levels of comfort to participate. So it's really crucial that there are skilled facilitators that are always there and who are neutral. Yeah. And the second question about where has it been more than just advisory, there aren't very many examples of that, and I think that this is one of those questions that people who are working in this space are grappling with about what's next. The only place that I know about where it's a little bit more than just advisory is in the Polish city of Gdańsk, where there have been 3 citizens panels, they've called them, the way it translates from Polish, where the mayor ahead of time had agreed to take the recommendations that came out of it as binding, and had then acted. I mean, this is the very sad story of the mayor who was killed recently. So, you know, there's a lack of continuity there for other reasons that we recognize, but still, it has set the tone, I suppose, in that city about what happens next with the use of these processes.
And a question here.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Guido. I'm a doctoral candidate in political science at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and I'm focused on the question as government responsiveness and how that affects voter behavior. So, yeah, it's very interesting to hear about these different projects. I have 2 very short questions. The first one is, so do you have any examples of these councils that go beyond the local or regional level? Because I'm kind of wondering, okay, so to what extent does this actually influence people's trust in government? And the second one is, how do you deal with the bias that these people who are in these kinds of councils are ones that tend to be more engaged in democracy in the first place? I mean, I'm imagining that none of these actually force people to be a part of this, so you're voluntary. And if you have a general population that loses more and more trust in these institutions, I guess more representative would be to have people who also have less trust in these institutions. So how do you deal with that kind of bias?
Thank you.
Yes, 2 very good questions. So first, there are lots of examples that aren't at the local level. It's true that I chose ones that were at the local and regional level, but amongst the, I don't remember the exact number, there's around 580 examples in the study that I'm looking at now. Around half of them are at the local level. About 35% of them are at that intermediary state or provincial level, and then 15% are at the national level. And we see actually right at the moment, one of the biggest ones, for example, is happening in France, where there's been 150 randomly selected citizens who've been given a mandate to give proposals to the parliament for new pieces of legislation to do with climate change. So they're meeting for 6 3-day-long weekends over the course of 6 months to work on that. In Ireland, there were a few citizens' assemblies that happened on different topics. The ones that are most well known are to do with same-sex marriage and abortion, because both of those had recommended that there would be referenda on those topics, because that's the only way to change the constitution in Ireland. But the remit was not just about yes or no. They also gave recommendations to the parliament about if people vote for a change, this is how the legislation should change. So there's lots of other examples, and I'm happy to talk more about them later. The second question about, yes, how do you avoid the bias about who comes out to participate? This is the eternal challenge of citizen participation in general. There's a lot of research which shows that for a lot of open forms of participation, whether it's online or town hall meetings, there tends to be a disproportionate participation rate amongst people who are older, who are men, who are well off, well educated, more urban. So this is quite well researched. So this is why the idea of random selection or sortition comes into it. And there's different methods of doing it, but the one that from my studies I think is the most rigorous is this idea of a civic lottery, which has 2 stages. And the first stage is that there's a large number of random invitations that get sent out. So it can be 10 to 30,000 invitations that go out in the post. And, you know, drawing on research also from psychology about what would make people think that this is important and worth their time, they usually go out on really nice paper. It's a letter that's signed by the mayor or the minister or someone who has the authority to act on it. It explains what the purpose is and how how this is meaningful in a way, that there will be a response that's public at the end of it. There's a Q&A page that's attached about, like, do I need to wear a suit? And things like this, which we might not think about, but actually which have a big impact on people's more willingness to participate. So there have been some studies done in places which show that the people who do give in the civic duty to do something like this are not the typical people who go to an open town hall meeting, but you do get people who haven't voted, who don't attend the town hall meetings, who haven't necessarily volunteered or been active in their community beforehand. And again, it's not a perfect method, because in the first instance, you still get a disproportionate number of people who fit those demographics that I talked about, which are more likely to participate, which is why you have the second stage of the random selection, where amongst all the people who say, yes, I'd like to do this, you again choose randomly, but you control for the facts so that it ends up being 50-50 men and women. You have a socioeconomic criteria, perhaps a geographic criteria if it's in a city or something like this. So there's ways to mitigate. Again, I don't think it's perfect, but I don't know of a better way to try and overcome that bias.
Thank you.